Sonic 06 is one of the most infamous Sonic games of all time, for obvious reasons. It was, for all intents and purposes, doomed from the start, with a team that was meant to be working on the game being split thin from the get-go, along with numerous time constraints imposed on the developers, ultimately resulting in an unfinished and buggy product, one that was very different compared to what was envisioned for it. One of the game's elements that also suffered from this was the story, which, despite being one of the less unfinished parts of the game, is supposedly different compared to what was meant to be seen. Well, it just turns out that sometime in 2006, an internal script for the game was leaked. The story goes that a UK tester obtained this script and leaked it to the Sonic Cult fan site. The document is called Sonic Next_all script, with Sonic Next being the project name for the game, standing for Sonic Next Gen. It contains a lot of insight into the game's development, including never before seen concept art, developer comments, character bios, and early versions of Sonic's, Shadows and Silver's campaigns, and the last story. Whether this is actually real or not is up for your interpretation. Considering the amount of stuff here and the length someone would need to go to fake it, I would say that it seems real, but I'm not gonna 100% confirm it, especially because I really have no one to confirm it with. With that being said, today we're gonna be taking a look at everything present in this document, and comparing every single difference between the early script and the final one. I'm going to assume that you know the story and its flow, so I won't really explain much about it when it's not needed. The script is divided into 7 sections, and I'll be covering them by mostly the following order. Character intro contains set character biographies, renewal points has the developer comments, number voice has some information about the recording of the voice lines, and the scenario sections are related to each character's story. So, the character biographies are much like what you would expect. Brief paragraphs that explain who the character is, their personality, where they come from and what they do, their backstory, etc., both in English and Japanese. Most of these characters use renders from Sonic 06, except for Blaze, which uses a Sonic Rush key art, and Silver, which uses concept art in the same Sonic Rush style. Of course, he looks very different compared to the final game, having orange fur, different colored boots and bracelets. His whole biography is also temporary, but we'll take a look at that in a moment. Other Soleanna related characters also use concept art or even early 06 renders, and Eggman and Mephiles both use what appear to be final renders for the game. Iblis still doesn't have any illustration at this point. At the end of the page, there's also information about who's the voice actor for the specific character. The ones present in English are the same as the final, the same for the Japanese ones. However, a lot of roles are still missing, even for characters that appear in other games, specifically Shadow for both English and Japanese, and Omega and Blaze for the latter exclusively. All of their voice actors ended up being the same ones from Shadow the Hedgehog and Sonic Rush regardless. On the same topic, and might as well cover it now since there's not much to say about it, the number voice section basically just shows the number of lines each character has in cutscenes and their voice actor in front. It also shows which one still needs to be auditioned. Weirdly, Jason Griffith is already shown here to be Shadow the Hedgehog. Another weird detail is that in the character intro tab, Knuckles' voice actor is credited as Jay Snyder, while here it's Dan Green. The former is his real name. However, the same is the case for Blaze's voice actress, and there's a clear distinction there between the real name and the credits name. I don't know, it's just something I noticed. This tab also shows that the recording was done between the 14th and 19th of March of 2006. Okay, back to the character profiles, let's actually take a look at them. I will say that most are simply modified versions of the ones present in the Sonic Heroes manual, even if all of them do have some more information than what's available there. The only real interesting things to cover are the differences between the Japanese and English descriptions. I'll get it out of the way. Sonic's, Tails', Rouge's, Amy's, Alice's and the Duke of Soleanna's descriptions are the same between both languages, and very similar to the Heroes ones for the characters that are there. None of the Soleanna characters feature anything to mention, nor do Mephiles or Iblis have anything that's different compared to what's shown in the game. In Knuckles' description, it's said in English that the reason for him to be manipulated by Eggman is his short-sightedness. In Japanese, it's his impulsive nature and kind-heartedness. As for Shadow, the translation is also almost identical except for the last paragraph. In English, it says that, quote, "It is unclear whether he still holds the same murderous traits he displayed in the past." In the past, meaning Sonic Adventure 2. However, in Japanese it reads, "It remains unclear whether the revived Shadow is the same Shadow from the Adventure 2 storyline." Well, if you're familiar with the story up to this point, it might sound weird. Considering what Eggman says in Shadow the Hedgehog's true ending, the Shadow present in both Sonic Heroes and this game is the same one from SA2, meaning that the playable Shadow was never an android, even if you do see them in both games. I don't really understand why there's this ambiguity in the Japanese script when the final Sonic 06 makes zero references to this, because it's supposedly an already resolved plot point. On the other hand, it can also be to not spoil the Shadow the Hedgehog story storyline because he comes to terms that he's an android in a specific ending or something. All of Silver's profile is said to be temporary, considering how early this was made and because he's a new character in the game. His age is said to be between 13 and 15, which checks out because his official age is 14. In Japanese, it says that his personality makes it so Mephiles is able to manipulate him. However, in English, it says that he's going after Mephiles, which doesn't really make sense considering this is a non-spoiler biography. It's also officially confirmed that he's based on Trunks from Dragon Ball Z. So there's that. In Blaze's biography, it's confirmed that she comes from another dimension, something that was technically already confirmed by official material for this game, however it's never really explained in 06's story how she managed to arrive in Silver's future. That part also goes unexplained in the early script. There's also that famous comment of her being self-conscious of her chest size or some shit. And as for Eggman, while the profile is the same between both languages, the Japanese text says that he has some respect for Sonic, and also explains the meaning of the expression Egghead used in the English script. Now let's take a look at the developer comments. The renewal point section has a ton of logs, 68 of them to be exact, of multiple things regarding the game's development, like explicit logging of things that were changed and things that needed to be changed in the script, sort of like a to-do list. All of these have the dates they were written at, which is very relevant for some things we'll see, and sometimes it even has the number of the line where the change was made. However, for the letter's case, at some point they abandoned this, and it's really not very easy to see which line is 671 for example, especially when it doesn't say which store it belongs to. The first change logs were made on the 7th of September 2005, 10 days before the official game's announcement, and the last one is from the 10th of March of 2006. This would make you believe that the script was finalized that day, as the cutting room floor page for the game's development would make you believe. However, as you'll see throughout the video, this is not true, as there are still a ton of differences in this version compared to the actual final story. At the time of the first comments, it seems that they were still figuring out how to organize the spreadsheet and how to name the events internally. Of this first, comment number 4 reveals that Silver wasn't actually called Silver, rather his name was Venice, much like the real-life city Soleanna is based on. This is also corroborated by comments 37 and 51, and Silver was given his final name on the 22nd of November 2005, with all references to Venice being replaced as of the 1st of February 2006. Similarly, Elisa's name was originally Origa, sometimes appearing as Olga or Oliga. She was given her final name on the 5th of March of 2006, 9 days before the recording of the script began, as evidenced by comment number 64. Despite these comments also suggesting that the script was mostly finalized as of the 10th of March of that year, the English translation had no real update since the 1st of February. All the other comments present here are gonna be covered as we go through the story, since they're directly related to that. All other ones I don't talk about aren't interesting in the slightest. It's just removing commas or dots, changing event structure, and just stuff like that. Now time to actually cover the game story, but firstly I want to talk about some general differences just so I don't repeat myself multiple times. Above all, the story is exactly the same as the final one. There's no early version of it that's free of time or creative constraints or more ambitious than the one we know of, at least not in this document. Even so, while a lot of lines are identical to the final, there are as many that were removed or changed for the final recording of the script. Similarly, most cutscene names, while sometimes similar to the final ones, are completely different and appear to be a remnant of a very rough draft of the game's translation, since it's like they're overly formal and descriptive. If you're wondering, the final names can be seen in the extras menu. Some bosses have different names too. For example, Excerebrus is called Amigo Boss 1 for Sonic and Amigo Boss 6 for Shadow. This specific case is weird because that's not what the game considers an amigo character. If you're wondering, an amigo is the game's way to describe the alternate playable characters that are not the 3 hedgehogs, so Tails, Amy, Omega, etc. It would make more sense to call the Sonic vs Silver boss, for instance, an amigo boss. However, they're just called the same in the early script and in the final game. On the same note, the Scepter of Darkness went through multiple different names. It was initially called Tears of the Sun, until it was changed to Book of Darkness and eventually became the Scepter of Darkness. Remnants of this can still be seen in the game, as there's a specific line in Shadow's story where it's referred to as the Book of Darkness.
Have you retrieved the Book of Darkness?
Town missions have actual names here. They also do in the final game, but only appear in the loading screen, so they go largely unnoticed. It seems that here they'd have a bit more importance. Some of these have different names or only exist in the early script and not in the final. For example, Sonic's first mission in the final game is collect information about Eggman. In the early script it's called Find Tails. Another example is the famous Go to the Desert mission in the script. This doesn't exist in the final game, not by name at least. It also suggests that the game would have a hub in the desert, desert, while in the final you go to the desert via the Dusty Desert Warp Gate in Soleanna Castletown. That much is proved by developer comment 18, which says that the town missions above, which we don't know as it doesn't show any, are still under consideration because they don't know if they'll create winter, desert or forest hubs. This comment is from the 12th of October, almost a month after the game was officially announced, meaning that this far into the game's development, the developers didn't even know what was possible to do with the time they had. Also, the story mandatory town missions given by NPCs don't appear in the early script, such as the shoemaker one at the start of Sonic's story. Most grunts that the characters make in the game appear as subtitles in the early script, yet they do not appear in the final game. Also, some grunts were removed from the final. Another oddity the early script has is that they'll have an exclamation point to show that a character is surprised, or a question mark for a character that's confused. Of course, this also doesn't appear in-game nor in the game files. This is relevant to know because these quote-unquote expressions are attributed a file name for a voice line. However, since the characters don't say anything in its place in the final version, there's usually a gap in the numbering of the voice lines because of this. Some lines show up in yellow as opposed to simply having a white background. This means that the line is shared with another event, which can be seen by the ID of the line and the ID of the event itself being different. In a different tone of yellow after a grey line, you can also usually see two lines, meaning that the grey line was split into two. In these cases, those two lines have their initial ID as if they were just a single line like before, but they appear with an A and B suffix at the end. This suggests that the two lines were recorded in sequence as if they were just one, but separated when ported into the game. This can be seen in the game files. Also, the events in which the dialogue is fully shared with another event don't exist inside the xenon/event path in the game files, which stores the voice clips for the cutscenes. This doesn't mean that the specific assets, animations, etc. for the scene don't exist in the game, only the voice lines are reused, so they aren't duplicated in the specific folder where they're stored. Further in the video, when I say that an event is missing from the files, I mean that it has no unique voice folder in that path. Finally, despite the events appearing in the script with the EV prefix, being changed from the E prefix to EV in the 5th of March of 2006, they still appear in the game files with the E prefix and not EV. Now let's finally take a look at specific story differences, starting with Sonic's story. I'll cover every cutscene and dialogue by the order that they appear, so everything is in chronological order. I also won't mention when the events have the same name between early and final scripts, so if I don't say anything regarding that, you can assume that there's no difference. The opening cutscene is mostly identical to the final, although there are some interesting things here. Firstly, the screams of the people when Eggman attacks are shown in the early script to belong to something named Ma. This is the only instance in the entire script where this appears. I'd guess it could only belong to the mate that also appears here. However, the final cutscene depicts screams of everyone present in the festival in general. When Sonic grabs Elise, there's also a subtitle for what she says, which was removed in the final. Weirdly, the first two cutscenes in the game, so this one and the one where Elise gets kidnapped, are just a single one in the early script. In other words, even if both the early and final cutscenes end with Silver Zibli's trigger line, all of the dialogue of the final second cutscene would happen before that silver line. This means that both cutscenes would actually be pre-rendered, instead of only the first one in the final game being that way. This cutscene also has a different name. It was called Sonic Meets the Princess, being changed to the Soleanna festival in the game. Since the second cutscene doesn't exist, there's no name for it. Another interesting detail about this is that, in the early script, Sonic's story only goes up to EV0030. This missing cutscene that was added in the final is E0031, showing that it was actually the last added event for Sonic's story, even if it's the second cutscene in the entire game. Then we get teleported to Soleanna Castletown, with the town mission collect information about Dr. Eggman. In the early script, the mission is called Find Tails, as I've mentioned. When you do end up meeting him, Tails says in the early script that he heard from the people of this city that Sonic tried to save Elise. In the final, he simply says that he heard he tried to save the princess, but doesn't say who he heard it from or how. After the cutscene ends, you need to find out about Eggman's whereabouts. The name of the town mission in the early script is Find Eggman's Battleship, while in the final it's called Find Out Where Dr. Eggman's Battleship Went. Then you have to do the obligatory Shoemaker mission, which doesn't exist in the early script. Then you go to Wave Ocean and experience another cutscene. The dialogue for this one is identical between early and final scripts, however its name is different. Sonic Abandoned eventually became Too Late Sonic. After after this cutscene, you'd get the Go to the Desert Town mission I mentioned previously. Of course, there's nothing like this in the final game, as you don't really go to the desert per se, you just get teleported there. The town mission here is still called Collect Information about Dr. Eggman in the final game. The Sonic Rescues Elise cutscene that plays after you go through the warp gate is identical between both versions, name and all. The ex-Cerberus boss, however, is called Amigo Boss 1, as mentioned previously too. After you defeat the boss, the dialogue in the event is identical between both versions, except for this Tails line where he says Sonic's name at the end, which was removed. The event also had a different name. The Princess and Sonic Go to the Desert changed to Let's Split Up. Developer Comment 19 makes a reference to this cutscene, Event 0004, and also 0019, roughly translating to changed so that E0004 and E0019 are not run, labor saving. I have absolutely no idea what this is supposed to mean. I presume that it would be some sort of transition idea between these two events and the respective stages that follow them, as they are identical in terms of premise, ending with Sonic and Elise running to the stage. However, E0019 apparently has this transition, since you get sent to Soleanna Forest when it ends and have to manually go to Tropical Jungle, while after E0004 you get directly put into Dusty Desert. After this cutscene is a town mission called Search for the Ruins, meaning it was most likely something you had to do inside the Desert Hub area. You can also assume that maybe it's the name given to Dusty Desert's mission, which is escape Dr. Eggman's minions in the final game. Yet many more examples of this in the early script will show that it doesn't really operate like that. I mean that it doesn't really show the mission text of the stages, rather just the actual town missions you get in the hubs, meaning this Search for the Ruins mission doesn't exist in the final. Anyways, you go through the desert and then another cutscene plays. Here Elise would ask Sonic what when he'd tell her to smile. The line he says after is also different and has a bunch of grammatical errors. Some other lines are also slightly different, specifically in Elise's explanation of Solaris, and Sonic's line after Elise says she can't run that fast. The events have different names, as it was called Running Through Fields and was changed to Running Through Plains. After that event ends, you'd get a town mission called Go to Soleanna Castle. Of course, nothing like this exists in the final game, as it transitions directly between one cutscene to another. It's presumable that you'd gain control of Sonic to go to where the silver boss takes place. Considering the mission name, maybe the battle would happen elsewhere, though Soleanna Castle is most likely meant to be Soleanna Castletown. The cutscene that plays directly after in the final game is identical between both versions, except there's an Elise scream that appears as a subtitle in the early script. You then fight Silver, whose boss has an identical name in the early script, and then Amy appears. All of the grunts at the start of this cutscene show up as subtitles in the early script. Developer Comment 34 also shows that the first Silver grunt was actually said by Sonic, which is most likely a mistake and simply got mixed up among the other ones. One of Silver's lines is also completely different between both versions, even if it means the exact same thing. The name of the event was different, being Rescuing Amy, which was changed to Saved by Amy because it makes no sense in the context. Afterwards, the town mission has a different name, and doesn't really make any sense in the early script. The mission that comes after that, where you have to meet with Knuckles, has the same name. When you arrive, another cutscene plays. Here, Eggman tells Sonic to take his friends to White Acropolis in his message, which was removed in the final. Knuckles' line after the message also accounts for it, but much like in Eggman's line, that part was removed too. In that same line, the noise he'd make is different, and there's an exclamation point expression for Sonic in the early script that doesn't appear as a subtitle in the final. The event was also called Knuckles has a letter from Eggman, being changed to Knuckles delivers a letter from Eggman. The town mission you get after it is called Head for Eggman's base in the early script, being Head for the White Acropolis in the final game. So you do go to White Acropolis, and after it is, of course, another event, which does have a bunch of minor differences. Knuckles' first line is different, as instead of saying they had to deal with his little pets, it was his metallic reception. There's sort of a surprise/anticipation subtitle for Elise, which was removed. Eggman would laugh after Sonic puts the Chaos Emerald in a capsule and before he presses the button, which is evidenced by the noise he makes in the final game, which is the same. However, the laugh was removed completely in this part. Eggman does laugh in the final game before the "with this machine I'll be able to control the flow of time itself" line. Even so, in the early script, he laughs after that line and the laugh itself is different. Elise would call for Sonic before Knuckles says no when he hits the wall, which was removed. This Eggman line about the machine requiring some fine-tuning is different, as well as the one about being able to complete his plans, which is structured differently too. As for the cutscene after, a few grunts are missing from the final, namely Knuckles saying ouch after hitting his head on the floor, and Tails saying oh before his first line. The event also had a different name, being Meeting with Shadow, eventually becoming Shadow and Rouge. The cutscene that follows is identical to the final, except Sonic asks Shadow if he agrees to work together, after, which was removed. The event also had a different name, as it was called Beholding Ruination and was changed to Allies. Then you go to Crisis City, and once again after it there is another event. While the dialogue is also very similar to the final, instead of Silver saying "I see it," he'd say "It's impossible." Considering the context, it's obvious why it was changed, since it doesn't really make any sense. Again, the event has a different name, as it was called Finding Silver and Learning of the Princess's Death, while in the final it's named The Death of Elise. The event afterwards and just before Flame Core is literally identical to the final, however the name was Group Search for the Emeralds and was changed to Beyond the Flames. After you finish the stage, Rouge finds an emerald, with the dialogue for said cutscene being identical. Once more, only the name of the event differs. Flames come out from Emerald in the early script and Fiery Iblis in the final. It was changed since, of course, Iblis spawns and now you have to fight it. Then you go back to the present, and the dialogue is also identical. The event was called Returns to Present Day with Chaos Control being changed to Going Back to the Present. After the Chaos Control, another cutscene plays where the dialogue is again identical to the final. As you can probably guess, the event name differs. Return to the Present Day in the early script and Return to the Present in the final. However, there's something more to this one. Developer Comment 45 says that they changed the calendar to a newspaper. This means that, initially, Sonic would pick up a calendar for whatever reason. The weirdest part is that there isn't any reference to any of them in the early script, meaning there were once cutscene details present in the document but were eventually removed. The town mission that comes after does exist but has a different name in the final game. They mean the same thing, but the early one doesn't make much semantic sense. However, after this one comes what appears to be another mission titled Hurry Up to the Station. This doesn't come identified as a town mission and doesn't even exist in the final game, since you don't get a loading screen when you learn you need to go to Radical Train. After you clear the stage, you rescue the princess, find Silver again, and she's kidnapped once more. There are a bunch of grunts and textless expressions that appear as subtitles here but don't in the final game. The event was called Silver Reappears, Shadow Reappears and was changed to Silver and Shadow, since the original name was odd as hell. After this scene, there would be a town mission called Chase Eggman, which doesn't exist in the final. It's presumable that you need to manually go from the Radical Train area to Soleanna Forest, but since there's no hub area for it, the game simply transitions between the previous scene and the next. There's also no real information on where Eggman went, so I guess that would require you to gather info in the new city or something, but there's nothing about that in the early scripts. The event that plays directly after it in the final game is identical in both versions, although it was called Elise Escapes and is Rescued by Sonic and was changed to Elise Jumps. The Egg Genesis boss fight is simply called Boss Battle for Eggman. I guess they hadn't decided upon the names of Eggman's machines yet. Now we have event 0019, the one I mentioned previously with a transition to Soleanna Forest before Tropical Jungle. Here multiple lines are different, although basically mean the same thing. Specifically, Sonic's first line and Elise's reply to it. After Elise says that she owes him a lot, Sonic says, and kind of just laughs awkwardly in the final, while in the early script he'd apparently been silent. Note that in the game there's no subtitle for it regardless. The event was originally called Conversation with Princess and Sonic and was renamed to Thanks to You. Developer Comment 15 has a note about this event, saying change location to Town Forest. This may suggest that it could have taken place somewhere else originally. Again, Developer Comment 19 also makes a reference to this cutscene, which I already covered. The town mission that comes after does exist in the final game, but much like other ones, the name is different but means the same thing. Then you go to Tropical Jungle and another cutscene plays at the end. Multiple lines here have differences, specifically different tones and implications. Elise's first line means the same thing, however it's structured differently. Sonic in the final game says that Elise should go back to the castle, while in the early script he'd tell her to go back to the castle, meaning it was originally an order and not a suggestion. Also, Elise tells Sonic to remember Soleanna if he leaves to go on another adventure in the final game, while originally she'd ask him to remember when he goes on another journey. This shows a contrast between the certainty of Sonic leaving in the early script versus the possibility of him not leaving in the final game. Even so, the finals line is weird since Sonic just told her that he'd leave when he defeats Eggman. Finally, the Duke of Soleanna would say "and" after his final line, where the flashback would then end. Of course, this would be a tease to the fact that he had more important stuff to say, but it was removed for whatever reason. The event also had a different name originally, as it was called called Sonic and Princess in the Forest, while the finals is called Sonic and Elise in the Forest. Developer comment 21 makes a reference to this event, saying that it will be a movie rather than an actual event. A movie is a pre-rendered CGI like the opening cutscene. Of course, the final event is like that, but it apparently seems like the plans were different at some point. While in the final game another cutscene comes up directly after, the early script has a town mission called Seek Information of the Eggman Base. This means that you probably had to go from Soleanna Forest to the castle town directly, where you then grab information on Eggman or something like that. I don't know how or when the next cutscene would play, but yeah. Speaking of which, it is identical to the final, but there are two subtitles saying people clamoring and loudly murmuring things like "What's that?" Despite that technically happening at the start of the finals cutscene, it comes up at the end of the early version, as if it was the last thing to happen, which doesn't make much sense.
Princess Elise, ruler of Soleanna, by refusing to negotiate with me, you have forced me to take drastic...
The event was called Elise Heads to the Specified Place Alone and is named Elise Goes Alone in the final. After this, you'd get the track Princess Tales, between parentheses, town mission, which is called Head for Wave Ocean in the final game. Tails' Wave Ocean mission is called Find Elise in the early script, being renamed to Follow Elise. After going through the stage, there's another event. A few lines are different, but they are technically identical, but are more or less descriptive or are simply structured differently. On screen you can probably see them with comparisons, though I'm literally just talking so you have more time to read it. The event was called Plot of Eggman and was changed to Eggman's Plot. The town mission that comes after indicating you to go to Kingdom Valley exists in the final game, but as almost always the name is slightly different. The cutscene with Silver that plays when you get into the Warp Gate is identical, however it was called Silver Appears, and in the final its things have changed. Interestingly, developer comment 33 reveals an even earlier name for the event, Venice Supports Sonic, with the same going for the equivalent cutscene in Silver's story. After Kingdom Valley, the dialogue in this cutscene is identical, however a lot of lines have been split, since originally there were only 3 of them. The event was also called Surprised at the Warning Sound Occurring, instead of Out of Control like in the final. The next cutscene follows the previous one in the sense that you see the continuation of the exploding battleship. Here, Silver's line about returning to the past to save Elise is slightly different. Sonic also shouted Elise's name before entering the time-space rift, which was removed. The event's name was changed from Sonic Shouts Chaos Control with Silver to Battleship Explosion. There is something to note about this cutscene with developer comment 20 though. Well, realistically with this one and the previous two. This comment mentions that event 0025 was created as a real-time event, and that they had to figure out a way to stream events 0024 and 0026 together. However, what you may not realize is that event 0025 was removed from the final game, as there's literally a jump between 0024 and 0026 in the game files. It was simply called The Battleship Explodes, and would take place between the Out of Control and Battleship Explosion cutscenes I mentioned. It was apparently integrated into event 0024 at the end and 0026 at the start, so I guess that was their way of streaming those events together. It was probably a case of too many loading screens for showing basically the same thing multiple times. Also, developer comment 29 shows that Silver's last line in the final game wasn't present in Sonic's story, only in Silver's, being added on the 19th of October 2005 to both. The cutscene for when Sonic time travels is identical since there's no dialogue, but it was called Returns to one day prior to the previous time and was renamed to the day before for obvious reasons. The town mission you get after this to go to Aquatic Base exists in the final game, but the text is only very slightly different. The event after the stage is also identical, but the computer would only have 2 lines which were split into several ones. Again, the event name is different, as it was called Sonic Gets into the Battleship, but was renamed to Sonic Boards the Battleship. Then you get the cutscene just before the final boss, which was apparently gonna start identically to the Out of Control scene, borrowing all of its lines. In the final game it only starts similarly, but Eggman's initial lines are different and shorter. The event was also called Warning Sound / Sonic Appears, while in the final it's Showdown with Eggman. I don't know if it was meant to have the slash and everything, or if they were still undecided on the name. The Egg Wyvern boss, much like Egg Genesis, is simply called Boss Battle 5 Last Boss Eggman, meaning it had no name yet. And finally, we arrive at the last cutscene of Sonic's story. The dialogue is identical though. The event name differs as expected. Sonic escapes from the explosion in the early script and Nice Smile in the final. Now let's take a look at Shadow's story. It starts with Shadow infiltrating White Acropolis, and the dialogue for it is identical between both versions of the script. The event's name was originally Shadow Sneaks into the Base and was renamed to Shadow's Infiltration. Developer comment 24 makes a reference to this event, reading something along the lines of replacing ear-mounted communication device with wrist-mounted device. This suggests that Shadow's telecommunicator was originally attached to his ear and not the wrist. After it ends, you go through White Acropolis, where at the end of it, there's an event in the early script that doesn't exist in the final game, being Event 0101. It has absolutely no dialogue and was called Rescuing Rouge. It's apparent that there would be a small scene where you freed Rouge, which would then transition to the next one when you're already with her. This doesn't mess up the internal order for the events in the finals files, as there's a gap between EO100 and EO102. Speaking of Event 0102, the dialogue between both scripts is also identical, although the name was originally the 2 Attempt to Escape, and in the final it's simply named Attempt to Escape. Developer comment 35 references this cutscene in the sense that they log that this Rouge line was once a single one and was eventually split. Unlike many other examples I've covered, the early script doesn't hint at this with a yellow background, meaning it was probably one of the first instances of it. After it, you fight with Cerberus, which is called Amigo Boss 6 here as I've mentioned. I don't know if the plan was for it to be a different boss, considering it was called Amigo Boss 1 in Sonic's story. Probably, but we can't know for sure. When the boss ends, you get into this room and learn stuff about Soleanna, I guess. Some lines here are slightly different. When Rouge says some random trivia about it, the order in which she says them is different. Specifically, she mentions the primary industries first and then who the Sovereign is last in the final game, while in the early script the order is reversed. After saying she just followed her orders and retrieved the item, she'd originally say C afterwards, meaning there'd be some sort of animation of her showing Shadow the Scepter of Darkness again, which was a bit redundant. Rouge also has a removed line about hating dirtying her hands dealing with their relentless pursuers. The event was originally called To the Old Castle of Soleanna and was renamed as To the Ancient Soleanna Castle. Developer comment 58 makes a reference to this scene, specifically asking that Elisa's age is removed from the line where Rouge says who the Sovereign of Soleanna is. This was probably done because her age wasn't decided upon yet, and that change is already reflected in the early script as that specific detail is missing, much like the final game. The town mission that follows exists in the game, but the name between both versions is different. Then you go through Kingdom Valley, in the final game that is, because in the early script you'd go through Kingdom Volley and the cutscene plays at the TGS 2005 reveal trailer area. Okay, if you're wondering, the Volley typo only happens here. In Japanese it's written correctly, as is in Sonic's and Silver's story. About the cutscene, Rouge calls for Shadow only after Eggman says the pull back line in the early script, while in the final game she does so before Eggman says it because Shadow approaches the Scepter of Darkness. Of course, given this context, the early script's version doesn't make much sense since Eggman flees due to Mephiles escaping the scepter. Speaking of Mephiles, his first line in the early script was removed from the final game for reasons that are unclear. As always, there are a ton of screams, grunts, expressions, etc. present as subtitles in the early script which aren't shown in the game but are said. Well, most of them at least. The event that comes after has slightly different shadow lines. In his first one, he'd call Mephiles that stranger when he says that they've been teleported to another location, which was removed. His last line was also separated in two for some reason, which is also reflected in the game files. The game then transitions into another cutscene, where only Shadow's first line is slightly different, as it's missing the "so" at the start, which was added in the final version. However, the game features this subtitle with both the "so" and the "it's" as capital letters, almost as if it was added as an afterthought. The event after that is almost identical to the final. The entire dialogue is borrowed from Event 0010 in Sonic's story, meaning that this one, Event 0107, is missing from the game files as it simply plays the same one. However, this quote-unquote identical dialogue is different from the one present in Sonic's story in the early script also, specifically Rouge's first line, where she says "oh dear" instead of simply "oh", meaning that this depicts an even earlier version of the scene's dialogue. As you'll see throughout the video, there are many more cases of this, such as in the very next scene, where all the dialogue is also borrowed from Sonic's story, specifically Event 0011, so Event 0108 doesn't exist in the final. The differences here are, in Shadow's second line, he says "but this requires a lot lot of energy in the final game, and which requires a large amount of power in the early script. Sonic's last line about working together also has the same difference as before, specifically asking Shadow if he agrees with it, but he also says that they need to work together on this one, with those last 3 words being absent in the final and in Sonic's early script. The event was originally called Group Search for the Emeralds and was changed to Allies. Then you go through Crisis City and find Omega in another scene. Here, Shadow's first line is slightly different, as he originally said that Omega is in some kind of standby mode, while in the final he just affirms that he's in standby mode. The event was also called Omega is Found and was renamed to Omega Located. The cutscene before Flame Core is also completely borrowed from Event 0013 in Sonic's story, so the ID 0110 is missing from the game files. However, Tails' first line is different from both that story and the final game, even if it means the exact same thing. The event was called Flames Before the Chaos Emerald and was renamed to Beyond the Flames. In contrast, the event after you finish Flame Core, while also borrowing its entire dialogue from Event 0014, meaning Event 0111 doesn't exist, is identical to the final. The only thing that differs is the name, which was Flames from the Emerald and was changed to Fiery Iblis. Same as Sonic's story, you fight Iblis after this, and once again, the cutscene after also borrows its dialogue from Event 0015. Even so, since these events that only have shared voice lines don't exist by the same ID in the game files, Shadow's expressions in the early script, identified as EV0112_02 and _03, are also absent in the files as there's no subtitle or even a voice clip for them. They're expressed through animation. If you're wondering, yes, this means that there's a jump between E106, the computer room scene in the future, and E109, the Omega cutscene, and the latter, and E113 in the files. At this point, Shadow and Rouge get separated, but the next scene follows her. The dialogue is identical to the final, and the event name is only very slightly different. Rouge goes to the present in the early script, Rouge returns to the present in the final. The town mission after that directs you to Tropical Jungle is present in both versions and with the same name. As suggested, you go through that stage and find Omega at the end. The start of Omega's last line is different in both versions, as while in the final game he starts by simply saying System Reactivation Countdown Initiated, in the early script he says, Acknowledged, system reactivation will commence after 1,743,216 hours. Interestingly, the number in the Japanese script is different, being 1,778,256. I thought these may have been references to something, but all I can find with those numbers is a purge valve for a 2015 to 2016 Volvo V60 and a sealant for the front bumper of a Ford Fiesta MK7 from 2008. The event was also called Acquiring Omega and was renamed to Trusting Omega. Developer Comment 38 references this scene, logging the removal of a line where Rouge would have said, "What the heck is this?" I don't know how, when, or why it would be there, but yeah. Then you go back to Shadow, where his cutscene with Mephiles has a slightly different line. As he said, "Who did this, you may ask," and not "What did this, you may ask," like in the final. Anyways, Shadow tells him to go fuck himself or something, then you fight him and Omega appears to help you. Omega's last line is different. Originally he said, "I shall provide assist," which was changed to "I shall assist," for obvious reasons. The event was also called Omega Shows Up and was renamed to Omega Appears. After you finally defeat Mephiles, Shadow's last line is different. Originally he said, "I won't let you escape," while in the final he just screams Mephiles' name. The cutscene after for when Shadow and Omega return to the present is literally identical to the final. The town mission that follows it exists in both versions, although the name is different as the final tells you where to go. When you reach the warehouse district, the event with Rouge has multiple different lines. After Omega asks his questions, Shadow would say that the quickest way to find the answers is to ask him directly, which was changed to "I will ask him directly." I guess the first iteration kind of sounds like he's telling Omega to find out on his own. Shadow's line after that one is also different and is less descriptive for both what he's gonna do and what he asks Rouge to do. One of her lines after that is also different, although means exactly the same thing. The event was originally called Appointment with Rouge and was renamed to Working with Rouge. Developer Comment 41 references this event, as Shadow's "the quickest way to find the answers is to ask him directly" line was originally said by Sonic apparently. Since he's not even in this scene, I guess it was some kind of mistake. The town mission that follows exists in both versions, but as in other instances the name is different. It also suggests that the early version would have you walk around town to gather information, while the final simply tells you where to go. And that place is Radical Train. After you beat it, there's a cutscene which dialogue is identical between both versions, although the name is different of course, originally being Shadow and Eggman's conversation renamed to Who is Mephiles. The cutscene after that borrows dialogue from Event 0017 in Sonic Sonic story, meaning event 0121 is missing in the files. However, this early version is much shorter compared to the final one, as the latter is identical to Sonic's cutscene while the early one starts almost at the end. The event was called Shadow vs Silver Panic and was changed to Helping Sonic. After beating Silver up, there's another scene. While both of them say Chaos Control in the final game, originally Shadow would say Chaos and Silver would complete with Control, so I guess you wouldn't hear them both say it in its entirety. Shadow's line after this is slightly different, as he referred to Silver as he instead of you, almost as if he was talking to someone else. In contrast, Shadow's last line is completely different. I mean in structure at least, not in meaning really. I guess that the final line is a bit simpler and less descriptive. While in the final game this cutscene transitions directly to another one after they time travel, in the early script there's a mission called Find the Castle Entrance. This suggests one of two things. Either the previous cutscene would end in a different way, where they wouldn't travel in the scene and would rather do so after you explore the bit, or they would travel in that event but it would transition to a gameplay section in the past, where you had to find the entrance to the castle, which would then play the following cutscene. Either way, the early script doesn't say what it could be. The event after is identical except for one of Silver's lines, where he'd say that flame is Iblis, instead of that flame, it's Iblis. It's the same thing, it would just be said in a different way with a pause in a different place. This prompts you to go after Mephiles in Aquatic Base, and after it you seal Mephiles into the Scepter of Darkness. This cutscene has some lines for him during the sealing process in the early script that ended up being removed. Something about him being the sun, transcending time itself, and being a bridge to other worlds. I guess that at this point it wasn't really explained that Mephiles and Iblis are part of Solaris, and that Solaris exists at all points in time or something, so it was kind of a spoiler if you could deduce what he said. The event name was also changed from Mephiles Sealed to Sealing Mephiles. Developer comment 39 references this cutscene, being the one where they say that the name Tears of the Sun was changed to Book of Darkness, even if it is already referred to as the Scepter of Darkness in the document. The event after for when Shadow and Silver return to the present is identical between the versions, except the name was originally Leaving the Scepter of Darkness and Returning to the Present, but was renamed to Leaving the Scepter of Darkness, probably because it was too long of a name. Then we finally arrive at the present again, where some of the lines for this cutscene are a bit different. When Rouge asks Shadow what he found 10 years ago, she'd start the sentence with hey, which is absent in the final. Shadow's line for when he asks her to look up what the Scepter of Darkness is made from in Gun's database is also structured differently in the early script. The event was originally named Learning the Method of Sealing and was renamed to The Sealing Revealed. The town mission that comes after does exist in the final game, but the name is different. However, it's followed by another one called Head to Wave Ocean, which doesn't exist in the final game, at least not by name in a loading screen. It can be deduced that it come up at the same time as the Gun Agent line that plays after you complete the interior town mission. This is also the same line where the voice actor messes up and repeats it.
E123 Omega has engaged Mephiles. Head to the Wave Ocean, head to Wave Ocean. Agent Shadow, E123 Omega has engaged Mephiles. Head to Wave Ocean immediately.
After you complete Wave Ocean, Omega confesses that he's the one that will seal Shadow in the future. Well, apparently in the early script it was Elisa's confession, not Omega's. Okay, that's only the name of the scene, as the speakers are the same as the final. However, this may be a remnant of a different plan in development. The line where Rouge says "despite that" in the final game had a bit more text, which ended up being removed. Also removed was this Omega line when he says that this has always been the case throughout history, and so it seems in the future, after he says that something too powerful becomes the world's enemy. The town mission after it exists in both versions, however the final name is different. Interestingly, it's the same head for the desert mission in the early Sonic story that prompted the comment about the desert, snow and forest hubs. Here of course you simply go to the warp gate, much like in Sonic's story, although he doesn't have this town mission in the final game. The cutscene that plays before Dusty Desert is identical to the final in everything it seems. The one after the level is also identical, however one of Mephiles' lines was split into two, which can be seen in the game files. The event was called Powered Up Mephiles and was renamed to Mephiles' Temptation. Speaking of which, the final boss battle with Mephiles is called in the early script Powered Up Mephiles 2. Of course, in the final version the boss is simply called Mephiles, so I guess it was called this in the early script to depict him in his true form or something. After you beat his ass, a couple of lines are different, specifically Rouge's first line, where she'd say that the Scepter of Darkness is destroyed, with the name of the object being removed in the final. And Mephiles would say, no matter matter what you do, the world will still betray you, which was changed to It's futile, the world will betray you. Finally, the event was called Battle with Split Mephiles and was renamed to Showdown with Mephiles. Now time for Silver's story. His first cutscene is identical to the final, except for the name, which was Ruined World of the Future and became The Ruined World of the Future. Well, Iblis appears again in this scene, so you need to go through Crisis City to fight him. The event that plays right before the boss fight is identical, since there's only a single line, but developer Comment 47 apparently corrected the speaker from Rouge to Silver. Your guess as to why it was like that is as good as mine. I personally think it was just an oversight and not actually something that was different earlier in development. Iblis's boss fight has the same name in both versions. The cutscene with Mephiles after it has a slightly different Silver line after he's told he needs to defeat who awakened Iblis, as it was simply "Is that the answer to our problem?" instead of "Is that really the answer to our problem?" like in the final game. The event after also has some slightly different lines. What's important to note is that half of its dialogue is borrowed from event 0012 in Sonic's story, meaning it also depicts an earlier version of that scene's dialogue that isn't seen in Sonic's section. Silver's "But that's impossible" line about changing the past was originally "But I can't do that." Mephiles' line explaining how to change the past to rewrite the future has a different structure in the early script, having a lot of repetitions and just being unnecessarily long, so it was changed. A few other minor differences are seen specifically in these two lines, where the "so" at the start of the sentence is present in the early script but absent in the final in the first example, and vice versa in the second one. Much like in Sonic's version of this event, Silver says "impossible" instead of "I see it." The event was also called "She's the Iblis Trigger" and not "He's the Iblis Trigger." Once again, I guess this is only a mistake and was really just meant to be "He's the Iblis Trigger," or very early in development they were actually meant to be talking about Elise or something. Silver then travels to the present time, which cutscene is identical between both versions. The town mission that prompts you to go to Tropical Jungle is also present in both. However, the name is different. I guess this was done because Silver doesn't know Sonic by his name, just as the Iblis Trigger. The next scene has you see Blaze arrive in Wave Ocean, and it's also the same between both versions. Developer Comment 59 makes a reference to this event because, once again, the last line speaker was corrected from Rouge to the correct character. I don't know what happened here. Of course, you get immediately put into Wave Ocean after this event. While there's nothing really important about it in the early script, there's something I want to point out. All extra acts in the three stories, so Tails' Wave Ocean, Rouge's Tropical Jungle and Blaze's Wave Ocean, are presented differently in the document. In Sonic's story, it's Tails Act Wave Ocean. In Shadows, it's Act 5 Tropical Jungle, presented like all other normal Shadow acts as if he was the one going through it. And in Silver's, it's Blaze Action Wave Ocean. Once finished the stage, you go back to Silver, who's watching what's happening in Sonic's opening movie. Here some lines are different. Silver would say "huh" instead of "hey." Amy would say that she'll help Silver after he helps her, which despite being what actually ends up happening in the final, she doesn't really say it. And Silver would say that he needs to do something after telling Amy to wait a second. The event was also called Silver Races Against Sonic and was changed to Meeting Amy. Maybe originally he wouldn't have been stopped by Amy here and would give chase to Sonic. Developer Comment 48 makes a reference to this event, saying E206 is a movie. Of course, now we know that it isn't, but it would have apparently connected better with Sonic's pre-rendered cutscene. The town mission that follows exists in both versions, but much like the previous one, the name was changed because Silver doesn't know that Amy's looking for this Sonic guy, even if she tells her that he's not Sonic. In the final game, you have to complete an obligatory town mission in Soleanna Forest to progress, which will then prompt you with another mission called Head for the Desert, which doesn't exist in the early script. Once you go through the Dusty Desert Warp Gate, a cutscene plays before you play the level. Weirdly, this event doesn't have a name in the early script. Developer Comment 68 references this event, as apparently Silver originally said "the sky is so blue" instead of "the sky is gorgeous." This is because the sky in Dusty Desert isn't blue, if you didn't notice. It was also the last change made to the script apparently. Then you go through Dusty Desert, or rather this the desert, and then you'd get a town mission to find Sonic before the next cutscene. Since the final game transitions directly between the results screen and the next scene in Soleanna Castle Town, it's presumable that, like in many other situations we've seen, you'd have to go from the desert area to where Sonic is. Maybe the cutscene and following boss would have even taken place in the desert considering what Amy says, but there's no remnant of that in the document. As for the mentioned event, all lines but the first two are borrowed from Sonic's story, specifically event 0006, so the dialogue depicts an earlier version of what's present there, especially considering that it was identical to the final. An interesting detail about it is that besides event 0208 existing in the files due to the first two Amy lines not being in Sonic's story, there's a line for Silver which is just a gasp, represented in the early script as an exclamation mark. However, despite it also being assigned a Japanese ID in the document, only the English version exists in the game files. If you're wondering, no, it doesn't play in the Japanese voiceover, only in the English one. Instead of saying your actions will condemn us all, Silver would say your actions will condemn us to a never-ending nightmare. Sonic also asked, who? After this, instead of who are you, which didn't make much sense, at least immediately, the event was called Discovery of the Iblis Trigger and was renamed to Finding the Iblis Trigger. Sonic's boss fight has the same name between the versions. The cutscene after it also borrows its dialogue, its entirety this time around, from event 0007 in Sonic's story, meaning event 0209 is missing in the files. As always, this presents an earlier version of the scene's dialogue. Here, Sonic would have originally asked who Silver was, instead of asking what he means. Considering how Sonic was supposed to ask who to Silver in the previous scene, it becomes apparent that he was asking who the Iblis Trigger is since he didn't ask who Silver was, even if he tells him anyways. Even if it's technically not a repetition, it's weird that he would ask for Silver's identity when he was already introduced. His line about Sonic turning his back on him is also different. In my opinion, Silver talking about making him pay for his lack of respect just comes off as odd. His personality in the final game isn't really like that, nor does he seem to care much about that specifically. The event was called Saving Amy and was renamed to Amy Puts Her Foot Down, considering she isn't the one getting saved here. The next scene where Amy leaves Silver has a slightly different line for her. They mean the same thing, they're just structured a bit differently. After this one, there would be a town mission called Meet Up with Blaze, which doesn't exist in the final game since it transitions directly to the next cutscene. Once again, it's presumable that you'd go on foot from the castle town to the new city. The following cutscene sees Silver meeting up with Blaze, where some lines are slightly different. Blaze's first line would say that she's been, quote, looking all over for Silver, while the final simply says that she's been looking for him. Silver's penultimate line does have a bit of a different meaning though. He originally said let's sneak into Dr. Eggman's base and find out who he's looking for, while the final clearly points out that Sonic is looking for Eggman, so they should go there to learn something new. The original line made it so it seems like they're infiltrating into Eggman's base without any real purpose. It may also sound like they want to find out who Eggman is looking for and not Sonic. The event doesn't have a name in the early script, weirdly. Another weird thing in the early script is that you'd get put directly into White Acropolis after that cutscene, while in the final game you are given the head for Dr. Eggman's base town mission. After the level, there's a very small scene before the boss. Even so, both the second and the last lines manage to be different, if only very slightly. The boss is called Eggman's Mecha in the script and is Egg Genesis in the final. The cutscene after the boss is identical between the versions. The next scene with Amy and Elise is almost fully identical too, but the sentry would say its last line in the early script before Elise and Amy's. In the final game, it's the last line of the entire scene. The town mission that comes after doesn't exist in the final game as it transitions to another event. In said event, a few lines are different. Elise would refer to Sonic as someone very important to her, whereas in the final she simply calls him someone I know. Amy's line about love changing everything was also a bit different. The event was named Elise and Amy's Love and was renamed to Elise and Amy's Discussion of Love. In the final game, a town mission comes up after this cutscene called Defeat the Pursuers and Escort Elise, which is weirdly absent in the early script since it better contextualizes the next cutscene. Speaking of which, the dialogue for it is identical, only the name differs, which was originally Eggman Kidnaps Elise and was changed to Eggman Attacks. The early script does have a town mission after this called Look for Clues on Sonic, which doesn't exist in the final as it transitions transitions to another scene, meaning the plan was to have more gameplay with Amy. The event with Silver, Blaze and Mephiles afterwards is identical to the final, with only the name being different, as it was Head for the Convoy Terminal and was renamed to Head for the Train Terminal. The town mission that prompts you to go to Radical Train exists in both versions, but again the names are different. After you finish the level, that cutscene where Shadow saves Sonic plays again. What's also the case again is that all of the dialogue for it is borrowed from Event 0017 from Sonic's story, thus Event 0218 doesn't exist in the files. While that was also the case in Shadow's campaign, as we saw there, the cutscene was smaller and Silver's version does have some different lines of its own. Specifically, Silver's "The Iblis Trigger Must Die" line wouldn't have a pause in the middle, and Shadow would simply introduce himself by saying "I'm Shadow" and not "I'm Shadow, Shadow the Hedgehog." The boss fight with Shadow has the same name in both versions. The cutscene after it has all of its dialogue borrowed from Shadow's Event 0122, so Event 0219 doesn't exist in the files, but the differences here compared to the final are the same ones as those present in Shadow's story. The same goes for the cutscene where they arrive 10 years in the past. All of the dialogue is borrowed from Event 0123, so Event 0220 is missing, and the differences are the same already covered in Shadow's section. Finish this scene, Silver goes after Iblis through Aquatic Base. The cutscene that plays after it sees him sealing it, where the dialogue compared to the final version is the same, except he'd say "hey" when the Duke of Soleanna fell, which was removed. Developer comment 25 makes a reference to this scene, as apparently there was meant to be maids here for some reason. The event was also called Iblis is Sealed and was renamed to Iblis' Seal. The cutscene after, for before Silver and Shadow return to the present, is identical, despite all but the final two lines being shared with Event 0125 for Shadow's story. There's a line for Silver that is simply an ellipsis, which is identified as EV0222_01, which is missing in the files. The event was named Leaving Alice and Returning to the Present, being renamed to The Talisman. The game then transitions to another cutscene where Silver meets up with Blaze in the present. Silver's line about the Iblis Trigger not being Sonic didn't have a pause, and Blaze would scream for Silver at the end of the event, which was removed. The event was named Blaze Return to the Present, which was renamed to Meeting Up with Blaze. I think it goes without saying that Blaze isn't the one returning to the present. Perhaps she'd be the one to time travel with Shadow. Who knows? Developer comment 49 references this event as it's logged that a line for townspeople gossiping was added, and that it was untranslated as of the 25th of January 2006. I don't know if there was ever something concrete written in the script for what they were meant to say, but this entry appears identically to how it does in the final game in the subtitles: crowd of people noise. In Japanese it reads, the sound of people chatting and gossiping. The town mission that appears after this scene exists in both versions, however it's called Stop Dr. Eggman's Plans, which seems more important than the Find Sonic objective that appears 1,000 times in this early Silver story. Anyways, this prompts you to do a bunch of town missions before you can proceed to Kingdom Valley. The cutscene that plays after you enter the Warp Gate is identical to the final and borrows all of its dialogue from Event 0023 from Sonic's story, meaning Event 0224 doesn't exist. The event was called Silver Goes to Protect Sonic and was renamed to Things Have Changed. Once the level is finished, the next event also sees all its dialogue borrowed from Sonic's Event 0026, so Event 0225 is missing. Contrary to the previous one though, this one does seem to be an early iteration of what appears in Sonic's story. Well, to be honest, the lines that are different are almost identical, except they're structured very slightly differently. If you look at them too quickly, it seems like they're just written twice, but they aren't. The event was also called Sonic and Silver Use Chaos Control and was renamed to Each Future. Developer comment 36 references this event, as apparently Silver and Blaze wouldn't enter the portal, which was changed so that they do, and some cutscene about Sonic giving a Chaos Emerald to Silver was deleted. There are zero remnants of this in the document besides this developer comment, so how it would have played out is anyone's guess. The cutscene before Flame Core has a grayed out line which is an alternate version of Silver's first. Despite it being the same thing in terms of meaning, it's structured very differently. The rest is identical to the final. Also, while there's a Japanese entry for Flame Core, it isn't translated in English for whatever reason. It's most likely an oversight. The event after it and before the final boss is identical to the final. However, the boss is called Iblis Nova in the early script. I'd assume it has something to do with him having legs, but even then he's just called Iblis in the final. Weirdly, there would be a town mission called Get Info on Mephiles after this boss. The final game simply transitions to the ending cutscene, so this is really odd. And finally, we arrive at the last cutscene for Silver's story, where Iblis is finally sealed. Silver would call for Blaze only after she says that she's gonna take Iblis, which makes more sense than doing it before she even says anything like in the final. Blaze's line about Silver being naive is also very slightly different. Well, before we take a look at the last story, I just want to mention developer comment 57, because I have no idea where to insert it. It simply says that the Shadow Amigo event was deleted. What the hell is this supposed to be? Your guess is as good as mine. So let's quickly look at what's left of the last story, which isn't much. The first cutscene for when Mephiles gets the Chaos Emerald has no dialogue, much like the final. However, the early script doesn't give it a name either. The following scene where Sonic dies had Elise simply scream instead of saying no. It also has no name in the document. The next cutscene with Shadow's team also doesn't have dialogue in both versions, but has no name in the early script. The exact same thing goes for the event where Solaris is resurrected. Now this one, where all the characters meet at a time-space rift, finally has things to cover, even if not many. Eggman's line about Solaris consuming all existing timelines and time collapsing and disappearing was originally a single line. It was made into two in the final game since it was way too long to say in sequence. This Shadow line is also different, as he originally said that it would have been possible to destroy Solaris if Sonic was still alive, but was changed to might have been possible, and Elisa's last line was changed from I will to I'll do it, when talking about performing the miracle to bring back Sonic. The event was named Distorted Space-Time, which was changed to the Time-Space Rift. Then you go to End of the World, while the early script calls it the End of the World, if that's a difference that you can even consider. The cutscene just before the Solaris boss is mostly identical to the final, but has a select few details that are interesting. When Elise is performing the miracle, she says that she wishes to talk to Sonic once again in the final game. In the early script, however, she'd say that she wishes to talk to him. This was changed because she talks about her father in the sentence before, so it sounds like she's referring to the Duke of Soleanna. Developer comment 54 makes a reference to this event, as the location was corrected from town to distorted space-time, apparently attributing this mistake to a typo. There's no reference to the location of this scene in the early script, so it suggests yet another detail that was removed from the document. Interestingly, developer comment 42 also mentions this event, as Elisa's line asking Sonic to come back to her and to his friends was originally said by Silver. Anyways, Sonic wakes up, Solaris is defeated, and the cutscene after it has no dialogue in both versions, but it does have a name in the early script. It's the same as the final. The event for when Sonic and Elise are floating in nothingness is identical between the versions too. The flashback cutscene after it has a slightly different line for the Duke of Soleanna, but everything else is identical. And finally, we arrive at the last cutscene of the game. Every Elise line is very slightly different compared to the final. Once again, they're just structured differently rather than what she's saying being different in its entirety. The event was originally called Parade Happy Memories and was renamed to Parade Past Memories. Developer comment 43 mentions this event, as the mate's I'm sure it's just a wind line was wrongly said by Elise. And that's about it for the analysis. Sonic 06 is one of those games that, much like other Sonic games sadly, promised a lot but delivered too little. The game was hyped up as being Sonic's most ambitious title at the time, being a reimagining of the game's universe in a more serious tone and in a new generation of consoles to boot. Now, I don't want to talk out of my ass about the politics of a dev team I wasn't even a part of, but evidently the mission was too great for how little effort was put into it, or rather how little effort Sega allowed to be put into it, since it's apparent that the team didn't have enough resources to make this game good, yet it's clear that they really wanted to. Even then, those issues aren't really reflected in the story, since it could be a lot worse considering the conjecture. Realistically, the story isn't even all that bad, but it is kind of repetitive, confusing, and just plain weird at times. Well, maybe too many times. It leaves a clear taste in your mouth that a lot of aspects were meant to be further developed and explored. However, they're simply glazed over like it's nothing. We have what is clearly not the earliest version of this script, but it seems like it was already written with these drawbacks in mind, but still clung to its general idea of what the plot was meant to be like, resulting in a product that, while not all that bad, doesn't really feel cohesive or sensical as a system, especially when characters are teleporting all over the place with no real explanation. It has a lot of good ideas, but as mentioned, they get held back by what the team had time to implement in the actual game. Maybe one day we'll get a reimagining of this game with the resources it deserved, but as it stands, both the game itself and the early script suffer a lot from a rushed development. And that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications, as these videos take a lot of time to research, write, edit, record, you name it, so I'd be very grateful. You can also support me on Patreon or YouTube memberships to get a early access to videos and your name in the screen at the end, as well as follow me on Twitter if you want, and check out my community tab once in a while where I post quite frequently with video news. And that's about it really. I'll hopefully see you soon.